1944. Across the skies of a dying Reich, thunder rolled where propellers once hummed. It wasn't a piston engine. It was something new, something terrifying. The world's first jet fighter, the Messerschmitt Me 262, could fly 150 miles per hour faster than any Allied plane. It could outrun the Mustangs, outclimb the Thunderbolts, and strike like lightning. For a moment, Germany had built the future. But the future came too late, plagued by fuel shortages, destroyed runways, poor training, and Hitler's disastrous interference. The jet that might have saved the Luftwaffe became a ghost of what could have been. This is the story of the weapon that should have changed the war, and the reasons it never did. Chapter 1. Birth of the Jet Age. In the late 1930s, the world's skies belonged to propellers. Engines roared with the deep rhythmic pulse of pistons and blades, machines of polished aluminum and mechanical muscle. But inside a small workshop in Augsburg, Germany, a handful of engineers were building something that sounded wrong. It didn't growl, it screamed. That shrill, metallic howl came from a device no one in aviation had ever truly mastered before a jet engine. The idea wasn't that new inventors in Britain, Germany, and even France had dreamed of using compressed air and combustion to propel aircraft faster than any propeller could spin. But only two men had the courage or obsession to make it real: Frank Whittle in Britain and Hans Joachim Pabst von Ohain in Germany. While Whittle struggled in near poverty to convince his government that jets were the future, von Ohain found a patron, the Messerschmitt Company, led by Willy Messerschmitt himself. And in 1937, deep inside a hangar in Augsburg, they built the world's first operational jet engine testbed. It was crude, a tiny single-seat craft powered by a Heinkel He 178 turbojet. On August 27, 1939, just days before Germany invaded Poland, the He 178 took off. It flew for only a few minutes, but it changed everything. Germany had just entered the jet age. At first, few understood what they were witnessing. The Luftwaffe's leadership saw it as a novelty, an interesting toy, but too expensive, too experimental, too dangerous. They had other priorities: tanks, dive bombers, mass production. But Messerschmitt and his engineers refused to give up. They dreamed of a fighter that could outrun bullets, a machine so fast that propeller planes would be obsolete overnight. By 1940, their blueprints had evolved into a shape that looked like it had come from another world: twin jet engines mounted under swept wings, a sleek, pointed nose, and landing gear that retracted smoothly into its belly. The prototype was named Messerschmitt Me 262 Schwalbe, or a swallow. It was the bird of the future. But the future takes fuel and faith, and Germany was running out of both. The first prototype didn't even use a jet engine. The Jumo turbines weren't ready. Instead, it took off with a piston engine mounted in the nose just to test the airframe. When the first true twin-jet flight finally happened on July 18, 1942, it was breathtaking. The Me 262 roared into the air at 540 miles per hour, faster than anything that had ever flown. Test pilots returned, white-faced, trembling, not from fear, but from awe. They described acceleration that felt impossible, speed that blurred the horizon, a plane that could fly away from any enemy before they could even fire. The engineers celebrated. They had built a weapon that could rewrite the war. But they didn't know they were already too late. By the time the Me 262 was ready for mass production, Germany's skies were burning. Allied bombers pounded its factories day and night. Fuel was scarce. Engines were failing on the test stands faster than they could be built. Still, the promise of the jet was irresistible. Luftwaffe officers called it Das Wunderflugzeug, the miracle plane. Even hardened veterans like Adolf Galland believed it could turn the tide if only it reached combat before Germany collapsed. Yet the Me-262's greatest threat wasn't Allied firepower. It was bureaucracy. It was indecision. It was one man's obsession. A man who looked at the fastest fighter in the world and said, "No, make it a bomber." And with those words, Adolf Hitler sealed the jet's fate. Chapter 2. Hitler's Fatal Order. In early 1943, the Me-262 was almost ready for mass production. Its sleek frame and twin jet engines promised to reclaim the skies over Germany, where Allied bombers now flew with near impunity. At 540 miles per hour, the Swallow could close in, strike, and vanish before a Spitfire or Mustang could even react. It was the perfect interceptor, the weapon the Luftwaffe had been praying for. But when the engineers presented the jet to Hitler, the Führer didn't see a fighter. He saw a bomber. News the meeting at the Rastenburg Wolf-S lair in May 1943 would become one of the most disastrous in aviation history. Messerschmitt test pilots and engineers arrived with blueprints, performance data, and films of the Me-262 in flight. They explained that it could outpace any Allied aircraft and decimate bomber formations before they reached German cities. But Hitler, obsessed with vengeance after the Allied bombings of Hamburg and Berlin, interrupted them. He slammed his hand on the table. "I do not need a defensive weapon. I need a blitz bomber." To him, the Me-262 was not a shield. It was a sword. He imagined hundreds of jets roaring across the Channel, dropping bombs on London, striking terror into British civilians like the Luftwaffe had done in 1940. The idea of a fast, unstoppable bomber consumed him. No argument could sway him. Luftwaffe generals like Adolf Galland, Göring's ace fighter commander, were horrified. Galland pleaded with Hitler to use the jet as a fighter, warning that Germany's skies were collapsing and that the bomber threat had to be stopped now. Hitler refused. He ordered that the Me-262 be redesigned into a fighter bomber, capable of carrying 500 kilograms of bombs. That single decision derailed the entire project for nearly a year. The engineers were furious. The aircraft had been optimized for speed, not payload. Add-in bomb racks, wiring, and release mechanisms threw off its balance and compromised its performance. Every redesign meant months lost time Germany no longer had. Meanwhile, the Allied bombing campaign intensified. By late 1943, factories producing the Me-262's critical components were under daily attack. Each delay, each meeting, each bureaucratic order pushed the jet further into irrelevance. Messerschmitt himself tried to play both sides. He promised Hitler a bomber version to keep funding flowing, while secretly continuing to prepare the fighter variant for production. But politics moved faster than his engineers. By the time the first bomber, Me-262A rolled off the line, Germany's cities were in ruins. Railways were cut, fuel stocks were gone, and Allied fighters prowled every kilometer of sky. Pilots trained on piston aircraft had no time to master the radically different jet. When the first combat-ready Me-262 squadrons were finally formed in the summer of 1944, the Luftwaffe was a ghost of what it had been. Fewer than 100 pilots were qualified to fly the jet, and most of them were veterans pulled from dwindling fighter units. The tragedy was complete. Germany had built a machine from the future, but it was trapped in the dying structure of the past. The Me-262 had the potential to change the air war, to make Allied bombers fear daylight, to give Germany back the skies. But Hitler's obsession with turning it into a bomber turned a miracle into a myth. As one German engineer later put it, the Me 262 was the fastest plane in the world, but its production was slower than politics. Chapter 3. Engines from Hell. Every great machine depends on its heart, and the heart of the Me 262 was unlike anything the world had ever seen. It wasn't driven by pistons or propellers. It was powered by two Jumo 004 turbojet engines, sleek metallic cylinders that compressed air, mixed it with fuel, and ignited it in a roaring stream of continuous combustion. When they worked, they gave the Me 262 a speed advantage of 150 miles per hour over anything the Allies had. When they failed, and they often did, the result was fire, smoke, and death. Germany had built the world's first operational jet engine, but it was a miracle held together by desperation. The Junkers factory, tasked with producing the 04, faced shortages of every critical material. Nickel, cobalt, and chromium, essential for high-temperature alloys, were nearly gone by 1943, lost to Allied blockades and captured mines. Without them, the engineers had to improvise, creating turbine blades from cheaper metals that couldn't handle the heat. The result was catastrophic. At full power, the engines reached temperatures that melted their own insides. The turbine blades warped, cracked, and sometimes broke free entirely, shredding the compressor in seconds. A brand new Jumo 04 could burn out after just 25 hours of flight. Many failed after 10. The pilots knew the sound of death before it came. At first the engine screamed with that high metallic whine, but then the pitch would change, a deep rumble followed by silence, as the blades tore themselves apart mid-air. Sometimes the fire extinguished, sometimes it didn't. One test pilot recalled, "You didn't shut the engine down. You prayed it shut itself down before it exploded." Even starting the engines was an art form. The early 004s used primitive electric starters that failed constantly. Ground crews often had to use compressed air canisters to spin the turbines manually, timing the ignition perfectly to avoid a backfire. A mistimed start could blow the entire unit apart. The engines were also fragile in flight. The throttle had to be handled with surgical care. Push it too fast and the temperature spiked. Pull it too fast and the compressor stalled. There was no room for error and no time to train new pilots to handle such temperamental beasts. To make matters worse, the jets were running on poor quality synthetic fuel, a byproduct of Germany's collapsing oil infrastructure. Contaminated fuel clogged injectors and corroded the turbines, turning maintenance into a nightmare. Mechanics often had to replace engines after every sortie. A squadron might take off with 12 aircraft in the morning and spend the next 3 days trying to repair 8. That came back. Despite all of this, the Me 262 was a masterpiece of innovation. It could climb like lightning and strike with devastating precision, but the Luftwaffe could never field enough of them to matter. By late 1944, production had reached only a few dozen per month. Every bomb that fell on a factory, every shortage of steel or copper, every missing shipment of bearings had all slowed the miracle machine to a crawl. Germany had created a weapon from the future, but built it with the materials of the past. The Allies, meanwhile, were producing 10,000 aircraft a month, each one reliable, repairable, and ready for the next mission. When the Allies finally examined captured Me 262s after the war, their engineers were stunned by both brilliance and fragility. The design was years ahead of its time, but the metallurgy belonged to the Stone Age. The British engineer Stanley Hooker summed it up best. They built the future, but they had to do it with sand. Chapter 4. The Training Crisis. By the summer of 1944, the Luftwaffe had the fastest aircraft in the world, but no one left who could fly it properly. The Me-262 was an engineering marvel, but to control it demanded experience, instinct, and a kind of calm that few pilots still possessed. The problem wasn't the technology anymore. It was people. At the start of the war, Germany's Air Force had been the envy of the world. Its pilots were elite, hand-picked, meticulously trained, and forged in the skies over Spain, Poland, and France. Men like Adolf Galland, Werner Mulders, and Hans-Joachim Marseille had written the rules of aerial combat. They were hunters, not soldiers, confident, lethal, almost mythic. But by 1944, that golden age was gone. The Luftwaffe was bleeding to death, not from enemy gunfire, but from arithmetic. Every new Allied raid over Germany cost lives that could not be replaced. Training schools had been bombed, fuel was rationed, and every month the replacements grew younger. Pilots who once trained for a year now received only a few weeks in the air. Some barely learned how to land before being sent to combat. The Me-262 was supposed to be their salvation. Instead, it became their executioner. Flying a jet was nothing like flying a propeller aircraft. Its power delivery was delayed, push the throttle, and nothing happened for 3 seconds. Then came the surge, a violent blast of thrust that could throw the plane into a stall if handled incorrectly. The landing speed was terrifying, over 200 kilometers per hour, twice that of the Bf-109. Pilots trained on piston fighters often overshot runways, tore off landing gear, or flipped the jet trying to brake. The 262's fragile engines hated sudden movements. One wrong touch of the throttle could melt them mid-air. Veteran test pilot Heinz Baer, one of the few men to survive more than 200 jet missions, once said, "The Me-262 was not an airplane you learned to fly. It was an airplane that decided whether you lived or died." By autumn 1944, desperation had reached absurd levels. Teenagers were being pulled from the Hitler Youth and placed into jet training programs. Many had never driven a car. Now they were expected to control a machine capable of 540 miles per hour. Instructor shortages made things worse. The Luftwaffe's best aces were dead or flying combat missions daily, leaving no one to teach the next generation. Simulators didn't exist. There was no time for repetition, no margin for error. Every hour of flight training meant burning precious jet fuel Germany could no longer afford. Out of hundreds of pilots assigned to Me-262 squadrons, only a fraction ever made it to combat, and even fewer survived their first 3 missions. One Allied report after the war found that for every Me-262 lost to enemy action, another was destroyed in training or on takeoff and landing. The runways were too short, the engines too weak for repeated restarts, and Allied fighters prowled near every airfield, picking off the jets as they struggled to climb to altitude. The miracle plane had become a flying death trap. In late 1944, Luftwaffe ace Galland finally got permission to form an elite jet unit, Jagdverband 44. He filled it with surviving aces, men who still knew how to fight, and for a brief, shining moment, the skies trembled again. The Me-262s of JV-44 tore through bomber formations with devastating effect. American crews began whispering about ghost jets that appeared out of nowhere, killing a bomber in seconds and vanishing into the clouds. But even this brilliance couldn't last. There were too few planes, too little fuel, and too few pilots left to sustain the onslaught. The Me-262 had been designed to win a war of technology, but Germany's war was already one of attrition, and the Luftwaffe had run out of what no factory could build: experienced men. As one German officer later admitted, by the time we had the jets, we no longer had an air force. Chapter 5. The Sky Becomes the Battlefield. By early 1945, the Me-262 was finally ready for war. Hundreds of jets sat lined up on airfields across Germany, sleek, silver, and terrifying to look at. To the men who had survived years of fighting in outdated piston fighters, the jet felt like a gift from another world. But that world was already burning. The skies over Germany were no longer a battlefield, they were a death trap. Every road, every rail line, every runway was under Allied surveillance. The Americans and British controlled the air so completely that even taxiing out of a hangar could be suicidal. And for the Me-262, that was the problem. It was unstoppable at 30,000 feet, but it was helpless on the ground. Allied pilots learned this quickly. By the time the Me-262 reached operational strength, P-51 Mustangs and Tempests were waiting above every jet base. They didn't try to fight the 262s in the air, they hunted them during takeoff and landing, when their engines were still spooling up and their speed was barely above stall level. The Luftwaffe tried everything to protect its new weapon. They built flak corridors near airfields, stationed older Bf-109s for takeoff cover, and camouflaged runways with fake barns and forests. None of it worked. American fighter groups soon had orders. When you see a jet, follow it home. The Me-262 would dive from the stratosphere at 500 to 40 mph, rip through bomber formations, and then run out of fuel minutes later. To return, it had to slow down, and that S when the A hunters closed in. When the jet reached combat speed, it was a monster. Its four 30mm Mk-108 cannons could rip a B-17 apart in a single pass. Entire bomber squadrons were shredded before they knew what hit them. Major Walter Nowotny, commander of Commando Nowotny, scored multiple kills on his first missions, proving that in the hands of a veteran, the Me-262 could dominate the skies. But even he didn't survive the war. On November 8, 1944, during a dogfight near Reshaped, his engines flamed out as he tried to evade Allied fighters. The jet spiraled into the ground, exploding on impact. He was 23. His death was a warning written in fire. The jet was powerful, but it wasn't ready for the world it was born into. When the Jaguar Band 44 Elite Squadron took over Me-262 operations, Galland Squadron of experts finally brought order to chaos. They developed tactics the jet could actually use: high-altitude intercepts, slashing attacks, and strict landing discipline, and for a few weeks, the sky belonged to them. American bomber crews began calling it the Silver Death. Entire formations would vanish in seconds under bursts of 30mm shells. Radar operators reported mysterious blips approaching faster than anything they'd ever tracked, but the effect was psychological more than strategic. In reality, Germany could field fewer than 150 operational jets at any given time, and by then, the Allies were producing 12,000 aircraft every month. No matter how advanced the Me-262 was, it could never outrun that math. The Allied bombing campaign continued to crush fuel depots, training bases, and production plants. Every day, fewer jets could take off. Every night, fewer pilots returned. By April 1945, Me-262s still roamed the skies, but their sorties were acts of defiance, not strategy. They were fighting ghosts, trying to hold a sky that no longer belonged to them. When American troops overran Luftwaffe airfields in the war's final weeks, they found hangars filled with half-assembled jets, missing engines, and no fuel in sight. The weapon that could have changed the war had arrived in time only to witness its own defeat. As one captured German pilot told his interrogators, the Me-262 was perfect, but by the time we flew it, there was nothing left to save. Chapter 6. Hitler's Jet Gamble. In the chaos of 1944, one man's decision turned a miracle weapon into a lost cause. That man was Adolf Hitler. The Me-262 could have been the savior of Germany's skies, a pure interceptor designed to crush Allied bombers before they reached the Ruhr or Berlin. It was built to defend, to strike fast, climb high, and vanish before anyone could react. But to Hitler, defense was weakness. He didn't want a guardian. He wanted a blitz weapon, something that could attack, a bomb, and humiliate his enemies. And that is how the Me-262, the world's first jet fighter, became a jet bomber. In May 1943, when the prototypes were still being tested, Luftwaffe generals urged Hitler to authorize full-scale production of the interceptor version. But Hitler, obsessed with revenge after Allied bombings of German cities, demanded that it carry bombs, turning it from a fighter into a blitz bomber. He reportedly told his generals, "The fighter cannot win the war. The bomber can." That single sentence doomed the Me-262 program. The engineers at Messerschmitt tried to argue. The jet had been designed for speed-adding bombs, meant redesigning the entire airframe, center of gravity, and engine thrust system. It also meant new training, new logistics, new maintenance procedures, all while Germany was losing factories, materials, and fuel to Allied raids. But you didn't argue with Hitler, so they obeyed. Messerschmitt engineers worked frantically to adapt the jet into a fighter bomber. They added bomb racks, modified the cockpit, reinforced the wings, and destroyed the balance that made the aircraft revolutionary. The new variant, the Me-262A, could carry two 250 kilo bombs, but it was slower, less agile, and burned through fuel at a staggering rate. Even worse, it couldn't climb fast enough to intercept high-altitude bombers. The Luftwaffe's desperate aces watched in horror as their only hope for air superiority was turned into a blunt instrument. General Adolf Galland, one of Germany's top fighter commanders, pleaded with Hitler to reconsider. He argued that a fleet of 300 jet interceptors could destroy Allied bomber formations in days. Hitler dismissed him. "Fighter!" he mocked. "You always want fighters. I want a bomber that will strike fear in London." Galland left the meeting convinced the war was already lost. He later said, "The Me-262 could have changed the course of air war if it had been used 6 months earlier as a fighter." By the time Hitler realized his mistake, it was too late. Allied forces were bombing Germany's railways, factories, and fuel depots daily. The production lines at Augsburg, Regensburg, and Wiener Neustadt were hit repeatedly. Engines couldn't be delivered, fuel couldn't be transported, and pilots couldn't be trained. Only in November 1944, a year after the first combat tests, did Hitler finally approve the Me-262 for full fighter use. By then, the Luftwaffe's infrastructure was collapsing. What might have been a tide-turning miracle became a desperate experiment. The consequences were immediate and devastating. While the Allies produced thousands of aircraft every month, Germany was struggling to build even 20 operational Me-262s per week. And those that made it into combat faced a nightmare. Fuel shortages, bombed runways, and Allied fighters circling like vultures. Even the pilots understood the tragedy. Veteran ace Walter Krupinski later said, "The Me-262 was a masterpiece, but Hitler's orders made it useless. It was like asking a racehorse to plow a field." When American troops captured Me-262s in 1945, they found piles of unused bomb racks, half-built fuselages, and engineers still trying to modify the design, proof that the aircraft had been sabotaged not by enemies, but by its own creator, AU obsession. It was the perfect metaphor for the Third Reich itself. Brilliant minds trapped under madness, technology strangled by ego, and genius wasted by delusion. Chapter 7. The Jet That Couldn't Save the Reich. By the spring of 1945, the Me-262 finally ruled the skies, but there was no one left to rule them for. Germany was collapsing on every front. Its cities were firestorms, its railways twisted wreckage, and its fuel reserves almost gone. Yet out of this ruin rose a weapon that looked like it belonged to another century, a machine so advanced that Allied pilots could hardly believe it was real. And for a brief flickering moment, the Me-262 was unstoppable. When the jet finally appeared in combat in numbers, it terrified bomber crews. Radar operators reported blips moving faster than physics allowed. B-17 crews described silver flashes that tore through their formations before anyone could react. An entire squadron could be shredded in seconds, then silence. The Me-262 struck like lightning and vanished like smoke. Its top speed of 870 kilometers per hour, 540 mph, made it nearly untouchable for any Allied fighter. Its cannons, 30 Mk-108s, fired explosive shells that could rip a heavy bomber apart with a single burst. Allied pilots compared it to fighting a phantom. You saw it, fired, and it was gone. One bomber gunner described the moment his squadron was attacked near Berlin. We saw streaks of silver cutting across the sky, then fireballs where bombers had been. The radio went dead. Everyone was shouting, but nobody saw where they came from. But the jet's brilliance hid fatal weaknesses. Every sortie consumed 1 to 800 liters of jet fuel, and by 1945, Germany could barely supply 10 of what its air force needed. Me-262 units often received just enough fuel for one flight per day, sometimes per week. Ground crews resorted to siphoning fuel from trucks and experimental aircraft. Jets were hidden in forests, refueled from barrels, and towed by oxen to save gasoline. It was high technology in a Stone Age war. Even when the jets managed to take off, their bases were under constant attack. Allied bombers targeted every known airstrip, and strafing runs from P-51 Mustangs killed as many pilots on the ground as in the air. The Luftwaffe's once mighty network of bases and logistics was gone. Each Me-262 that took off was effectively on its own. The engines, the heart of the jet's miracle, were also its curse. The UMO 004s produced immense power, but each lasted barely 10 to 20 flight hours before burning out. They used scarce alloys that Germany could no longer produce in quantity. Desperate engineers substituted inferior metals, causing engines to melt under their own heat. Veteran pilot Heinz Baer said, "We flew with one hand on the throttle and the other on the fire extinguisher. A single bird strike could shatter the fragile turbine blades." Pilots often had to decide mid-flight whether to risk landing on one engine or bail out and let the jet crash. Each Me-262 that took off was a gamble with death. Yet despite all this, the jet scored kills that astonished the Allies. It could dive, strike, and climb away before a Mustang could even turn. The U.S. Army Air Forces began to call it the Swallow of Death, a dark joke referencing its Luftwaffe nickname, Schwalbe. But for every bomber it destroyed, another was already over Germany's factories, burning what little production capacity remained. The Me-262 could win battles, but it could not win a war that was already lost on the ground. By April 1945, Me-262 squadrons were fighting in isolation. They had no fuel, no spare parts, and no bases left intact. Pilots slept in their cockpits because there were no barracks left standing. Engines froze overnight, weapons jammed, and airfields turned to mud. When Berlin finally fell, dozens of Me-262s sat abandoned on runways, some half-fueled, some still in crates. American and Soviet soldiers walked among them, astonished at their futuristic design. The war had ended before the weapon was even finished. In the months after Germany's surrender, Allied engineers took the jets apart and realized what they had been fighting. Within a year, every major power had copied the technology. The British built the Gloucester Meteor, the Americans the F-80 Shooting Star, and the Soviets the MiG-9, followed quickly by the MiG-15. The jet age had begun, but it was the Allies, not Germany, who would own the skies. As historian William Green later wrote, the Me-262 was not the weapon of victory. It was the weapon that proved victory had already passed Germany by. Chapter 8. The Legacy of a Lost Miracle. When the guns finally fell silent in 1945, the Me-262 stood among the ruins, a ghost of a future that had arrived too soon. All across Germany, Allied soldiers stumbled upon wrecked jets scattered in forests, hangars, and makeshift airfields. Some were burnt-out husks, others perfectly intact, their sleek frames coated in dust, their once deadly engines silent. It was as if alien technology had crash-landed in a medieval world, and in a way, it had. The Me-262 was more than a fighter. It was the first glimpse of the modern world, a machine born in a chaos of total war, built by scientists who were decades ahead of their time. Its jet engines, its swept wings, its high-speed aerodynamics, every element would go on to define aviation for the next century. But at the time, few Germans even knew it existed. To the Allies, it was both terrifying and fascinating. To historians, it became the symbol of the Third Reich's fatal contradiction, unmatched genius, sabotaged by madness. When American, British, and Soviet engineers inspected the Me-262, they were stunned. They dismantled every component, traced every wire, and shipped entire aircraft back home for testing. In the U.S., captured Me-262s were flown at Wright Field, Ohio. American test pilots described the experience as like flying into the future. The jet was smoother, faster, and more stable than any piston aircraft ever built. Even with its unreliable engines, the 262 could outfly anything in the Allied arsenal. One test pilot, Colonel Harold Watson, said, "It was like driving a car that could fly and realizing we'd been riding bicycles." The British took their own lessons. The Gloucester Meteor, already under development, was rushed into combat service before the war ended. It never fought the Me-262 directly, but it was inspired by it, refined by it, and became the cornerstone of Britain's post-war jet fleet. The Soviets went even further. They captured entire Me-262 factories and forced German engineers to work for them. From these designs emerged the MiG-9 and later the legendary MiG-15, which would go on to battle American jets in Korea. The Cold War jet race, the F-86 Sabre versus the MiG-15, was in many ways the final echo of the Me-262. In post-war Germany, however, there was no glory left in the machine. For most Germans, it was just another symbol of a war that had consumed everything. Pilots who once flew the Me-262 spoke of it not with pride, but with sorrow, a miracle born into the wrong time. General Adolf Galland, who had fought to use the jet as a pure fighter, later said in his memoirs, "The Me-262 was the most advanced aircraft in the world, and the greatest failure of leadership in military history. Despite its tragic timing, the Jet S legacy grew. Its innovations became the blueprint for every aircraft that followed. Swept wings, pressurized cockpits, tricycle landing gear, jet engines, all standard today, all pioneered in the Me 262. It became a teacher for the victors. Every nation that studied it took something away: speed, efficiency, and above all, the realization that the future belonged to the air. But its story also carried a warning. The Me 262 proved that technology alone cannot win a war. It showed that even the most brilliant invention means nothing without strategy, resources, and moral clarity. In the end, the jet that could have saved Germany became its final epitaph, a reminder that progress, when twisted by ideology, can become its own destruction. Today, a handful of Me 262s still exist, restored, repainted, standing silent in museums around the world. Visitors walk past their sharp noses and curved wings in awe, realizing that this machine once redefined what was possible in the sky. If you listen closely, you can almost hear it, the low, haunting roar of twin Jumo engines, the ghostly sound of the future arriving too late. Epilogue: the jet that should have won. In the spring of 1945, as Allied troops closed in on Berlin, a lone Me 262 streaked across the dawn sky, its silver fuselage cutting through smoke and cloud like a blade through time. Below, the Third Reich was burning. Above, the jet whispered of a future it would never see. That single image, a miracle machine flying over ruins, captured the tragedy of Germany's final days. Because the Me 262 wasn't just a jet. It was a promise, a glimpse of what human ingenuity could achieve, and a warning of what happens when that ingenuity serves madness. For the pilots who flew it, the Me 262 was both a gift and a curse. It gave them power beyond imagination and despair beyond words. They could outrun any enemy, outclimb any threat, but they couldn't outrun the collapse of their world. Many of them were barely in their 20s. They had grown up in the shadow of propaganda, believing in invincibility, only to find themselves guardians of a weapon that could not change destiny. One Me 262 pilot, Georg Peter Eder, later recalled, "When you flew the jet, you forgot the war. You were touching the future, but when you landed, you remembered there was no future left." The Me 262 was the ultimate contradiction, a weapon too advanced for its time, built by a regime that could never truly understand it. It represented what Nazi Germany could do and everything it had already destroyed. If it had arrived 1 year earlier, it might have rewritten the air war, shredding Allied bomber streams before D-Day, buying Germany precious time. But time was the one thing the Reich no longer had. By the time the jet finally took to the skies in real numbers, the Allies had already learned how to win wars not through machines, but through overwhelming production, coordination, and resolve. The Me 262 was a dagger, but the Allies brought an entire factory to the battlefield. When the war ended, the Jet S true victory began not for the Reich, but for humanity. Its DNA lived on in every aircraft that followed. The Cold War jet race, the supersonic age, the space race all carried the imprint of that first leap into the jet-powered future. Even NASA engineers studied its swept wings when designing early rocket planes in the 1950s. In a way, the Me 262 never truly died. It evolved, quietly shaping the next generation of flight. Yet its legacy was always shadowed by tragedy. It was the right machine in the wrong hands, the right idea in the wrong war. It proved that technology without vision is useless, and vision without morality is deadly. In the end, the Me 262 stands as both marvel and monument, a masterpiece of engineering and a tombstone for the world that built it. Today, when we look at its sleek body in museums, we see more than metal. We see ambition, fear, brilliance, and loss. The soft curves of its wings whisper the same story to every visitor, that progress cannot exist without wisdom. And perhaps that's the real lesson of the Me 262, not that it came too late to win the war, but that it came just in time to warn the future. The jet that should have won and why it didn't. A story of power, arrogance, and invention, and the machine that flew beyond its own century.